I've always loved exploring abandoned spots. I know what you're thinking, and I get it. It was always an odd hobby of mine. There were a couple of abandoned areas nearest to my house that I explored, but none of them were that interesting. And to keep people from calling the police on me, I took to visiting the neighboring town. For privacy reasons, I won't include specifics, as I still live close to this day. The town is run down, the grass brown and trees bare, with a singular shabby supermarket next to a gas station. I often went out rather late when I wanted to explore, and it was never my intention to steal or disrupt the overall space I was visiting. I was simply curious. And so, I left my house when the skyline had grown dark, with my bag heavy on my back, and started off towards the next town, which wasn't far, but took a bit of time on foot. By the time I made it, the street lights had blinked to life. The path I had turned down was paved with the houses on either side, each spaced out from one another, and at the very end of the road hunched this huge tree that leaned towards the edge of the road. A dirt path led backward, where I couldn't see. I decided to head there, silently hoping that I wasn't going to find anyone. Luckily, there wasn't, and the path wrapped around the house, tall and leaning, enveloped by trees, with a run-down shed further in the thick of the backyard. My adrenaline spiked. It was perfect. I started walking around the side of the house, checking to see if there was a car parked or a light on, but there was nothing. I rounded back to the front, sticking to the shadows. I tried the front door, but it wouldn't budge, so I wandered around the side again, searching for a back door, and found one, which after a few hard twists, pushed open. I dug through my pockets for my flashlight, and I clicked it on, holding it up to the room in front of me. Dust was caked onto every surface, and the air was dense and musty. I stepped into a kitchen. It was trashed. Objects, furniture, and silverware laid everywhere. As I stepped further into the home, I searched around for something. Anything to leave at the front of the door. There was this discomfort that I'd be followed, or that I'd need to run off. I found a ladder, not far from the door, and propped it up against it. The kitchen led out into a living room. To the left of the living room was a door that I couldn't manage to get open, and a hallway that led to a broken staircase that I didn't even think of climbing. So I roamed around for a while longer. Captivated by the atmosphere, I searched the hallway. The rooms were furnished colorfully, messed up by children's toys and simple decor. There was one room I couldn't access. Like the front door, it wouldn't budge, so I moved on. Next was the bathroom. The sink was broken and the floor grimy, and as I snapped a few pictures, I noticed a good amount of syringes covering the bottom of the bathtub. It raised some sort of alarm in my head, and I decided to leave. I walked back out into the hallway and made my way to the kitchen. But as I rounded the corner, I noticed the back door was wide open. The ladder was gone. My heart started to beat wildly. I didn't hear anything move while I was in the bathroom. Lord knows how long it had been like that. Since the door was already open, I took off and booked it out the door. I'd always kept a knife with me, but I didn't even think about grabbing it as I sprinted down the path back up to the street. And when I got to the end, I turned and looked back at the house. It was silent, frighteningly still. With my hands shaking, I called my friend Chris. A month or two passed, and I almost forgot about it, when I got a text out of nowhere from Chris, asking if we could revisit the house. I paused, giving it some thought. He would be with me, and I had recently purchased a handgun. It made me feel more comfortable with the decision. So we agreed on the day we'd return, and that was that. The day of, Chris clued me in that he would be recording to post on his Instagram. And in the back of my mind, it felt almost as if he was hoping to find something, or someone. I had already been in the house before, and truthfully, there wasn't much to see. Right before the sun set, I headed out again towards the town. Chris, who lived further away, had texted me, saying he'd left early to hopefully make it there, at the same time as me. And as I made my way to the house again, in a hurry, I found that he wasn't there. I didn't plan on going in without him, so I stayed outside, taking pictures of the house, the trees, when I heard music. It was low, but loud enough for me to hear it. Where I was standing, I walked slowly around the side of the house, until I could see through one of the windows. It was an ill-lit room, but was one that I don't remember seeing. Probably the door that I couldn't get open on my first visit. From what I could see, stood a wooden dresser with a collection of food wrappers, an old radio, and a couple books and magazines. I stood there for some time, seeing if I could make out anything else, when I saw him. It was a man, slowly waltzing around the room. His clothes were dirty, his hair hung in tangled, greasy strands. I watched him sway back and forth, with his eyes closed, a wide smile on his face. Right then, I should have left, because I felt like I was interrupting this poor guy. He genuinely seemed content. But before I could step away, his eyes snapped open, and he stared directly at me. Because I had been watching him so intently, I didn't expect him to stop. But he was looking at me, with his brows narrow, and his face scrunched. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face had formed quickly into a scowl. I reached my hand up and waved at him. "Hey man, I didn't mean to interrupt," I said. Even at my response, he just kept staring. He made no moves, but he felt threatening, just with his gaze. I stepped backward once, and then booked it out of there. I had nearly reached the top of the path. I saw Chris come around the corner, almost running into him. "Dude, what the fuck?" he said. "There's a guy dancing around in that house back there," I said, out of breath, and he caught me staring at him. "I think we should leave." "Bro," he said quietly. I noticed he was looking over my shoulder. My head wrenched around, and the guy was outside the house now. He was standing off to the side, nearest to the trees, and he had his mouth gaping open, in a scream from what I could gather. But he wasn't making any noise. His eyes were teary, hands clenched. I yelled out again, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," with my hands up. The guy closed his mouth, but still had the same grimace as before. "Let's get the hell out of here," I whispered, and we both left, speeding off in the direction of our houses. I know what you all are thinking. I'm a total dick. I get it. I feel the same way. I felt like I interrupted a moment that gave that guy such happiness. Even if it is one I don't particularly understand. I remember his face. How he looked as if he were crying when he silently screamed at us. Yet, as I said earlier, it was never my intention to intrude. And I think that explains my shame. Whether it was his house or not, it didn't matter. After that experience, it put a bad taste in my mouth, and I haven't visited any other places since.
My name is Mark, and this story happened around the time I was 12 years old. My mom and I lived in an apartment complex, and she worked nights mostly, so a lot of the time I was left home alone by myself. Because I was alone so often, my mother had my uncle install around 6 locks on our front door, which I understand can seem like overkill. I especially thought so at that age, but it made more sense when I grew up. We lived on the second floor, so if anyone had any intention of breaking in, the only way they really could get in was through the front door. Even though I thought the amount was redundant, the locks made me feel safe, and each and every time my mom left, she would always give me a kiss and remind me to lock all of them right as she closed the door. That night was no different. She left at the same time she always did. I finished my homework and sat out on the couch watching TV. An hour passed and I was starting to get hungry, so I made my way to the kitchen, digging through the fridge for something to eat when I heard someone knocking frantically on the front door. I froze. "Hey, is anyone in there? I really could use some help." I made my way over to the door, stepping on the small ladder that my mom kept by the door, and I peered out into the hall through the peephole. And there stood a man, and from what I could gather, he didn't look like he needed anything. "Open up, please, I'm really in pain," he yelled again. He had a hat on that covered the entirety of his face, as his head was tilted downward, but he was dressed in all black. I stood watching him for a while, hoping he would go away, when I felt something hard hit the door. Because I was leaned up against it, I felt the impact and I stumbled back, falling off the ladder. I hit the ground hard and I stared up at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched as the door rattled, the hinges moving as the door was hit over and over again. I could see the top quarter of the door start to give in. I was frozen, too scared to move as I began to panic. Whoever it was hitting the door so hard that parts of it began to come off, and I could gradually start to see the hallway from the outside. He was getting in. And then the wood split and caved in, the top half cracking open. I was able to see the majority of his head in between blows, and he stopped and looked up at me. I could see his face now, his hat now gone. I was still frozen in place, still too scared to move. He stuck his arm through and started trying to get the locks undone. That's when I began to scream, as loud as my lungs would allow me. I hopped up and began throwing whatever I could grab at him. Some things I missed, but others I know made an impact. I was too frantic to aim. I picked up my ladder and hurled it at him, hitting him directly in his arm closest to the locks. He slid it out of the crevice, and I could hear him cursing angrily beneath his breath. My throat started to feel ragged as I kept screaming, now yelling for help. Thankfully, I could hear people outside, footsteps hammering down the hall. "Hey man, what do you think you're doing?" I heard, followed by a few other voices. They were all yelling after him as the man would look toward them and then take off in the opposite direction. I could make out about 4 heads as they ran past the door after him. Crying, I called my mother, who was beside herself, and told me to lock myself in her room. I didn't feel safe enough with the top of the door off to leave it far from my sight, so I stayed in the living room. Shortly after, I saw my mom, running around the corner in tears. A group of men followed behind her, and one of them reached in and opened the door locks that were still hanging against the door. My mom ran to me and picked me up, apologizing repeatedly. Her voice was shaken with a fright I'll never forget. I found out years later that the man who tried breaking in was looking for a guy who owed him money, but got the wrong apartment, and I was simply the unfortunate soul to come across him. But in his pursuit of trying to smash through the door, he looked dead at me. So he knew it wasn't the right apartment, yet he still tried getting in, which still chills me to this day, that he had ill intent towards someone he didn't even know. Be wary of who you call your friends. It was a lesson I learned almost too late. It was my last year of college and I hadn't been as social as I would have liked to. For the sake of the story, I won't include their real names for privacy reasons, even if some of them don't deserve that courtesy. On the first day of that semester, I met a girl we'll call Lacey. She had sat next to me and immediately started chatting away. She talked herself in circles about nothing and everything, which I wasn't used to by any means, but was oddly comforting. Throughout my time in school, I had spent the majority of each year alone, so her presence was welcome. She was made of compassion and a certain charm, and as a result, she and I became inseparable. As I said, we only had one class together, but we were able to see each other a lot throughout that year, and as we were getting to know each other, she introduced me to her group of friends, Bobby, Kat, and Melody. All, like me, were in their last year of college. They all were cool, and each of us was close, but Lacey and I were the closest. Admittedly, I wasn't paying that much attention to my grades, because I was so happy to have a group of friends. It wasn't long before I was failing a couple classes, and with the fear of not graduating, I shaped up and started studying again. which Lacey didn't seem to like. As I said before, we've been spending a lot of time together, and I suppose she felt slighted by my lack of time with her. She was prone to being needy and extremely possessive at times, especially when she felt I didn't give her enough attention. Admittedly, I found it aggravating. I couldn't tell if I found her want to be around me sweet or uncomfortable. I pushed myself to believe it was endearing. It was a red flag that I simply missed. The longer I spent studying, the more irritable she began to get with me. She would become really passive-aggressive out of nowhere. If we were spending time together and I had to leave to go to tutoring, she would stall or make up excuses as to why I had to stay with her, which would lead to an argument and inadvertently make me late anyway. It felt like she was trying to sabotage me, and when I tried to bring it up to her, she made a wild accusation about my professor and me, saying that the reason I was dedicating so much time to tutoring with him was that we were sleeping together, which came as a shock. I didn't think that she would go as low as to say something like that, especially as my best friend. I was done with her then and there, and I avoided her as much as I could. Days after our argument, she tried texting and calling me trying to apologize, but I didn't want to hear it. I don't care how upset you get at someone. You don't go to lengths such as that out of anger. That type of allegation could have gotten me kicked out of school, and my professor fired. It was too far. Because of our falling out, our group of friends tried reaching out and asking me why I wasn't on speaking terms with her, and when I told them the reason, they all acted as if I were overreacting. The tone of the text changed from them wanting to know how I was, to each of them trying to bully and coax me into being friends with her again. It all was incredibly draining, and I blocked them all and kept on with the rest of my year. I would still see Lacey, of course, in my last period of class, but I did my best to ignore her and sit as far away from her as I could. When I did happen to look up at her or in her general direction, she was always staring at me with this half-angry, half-pleading look on her face. She would also try texting me in the middle of class as well. After blocking her, she even went as far as to asking the professor to be in groups with me for certain projects. Thankfully, the professor didn't oblige. In his class, I had been struggling with the most, and he was the one that Lacey made the allegation about. In one of our tutoring sessions, I mentioned it to him, telling him that I felt like she was trying to sabotage me. I didn't want him to go to the dean or say anything about it because I didn't want to rehash the drama. He promised me that he wouldn't say anything yet, but he made it clear to go to him if she persisted with her harassment, and that he would have to take it to the dean if it got too far. As the school year was finishing up, a lot of my classmates began throwing parties for the end of the year. With Lacey out of my life and me passing all of my classes, things started looking up. I had made a couple of friends even, and though I was weary of getting too close, they were good to me. I was invited to one of the end of the year parties. I was kind of excited about it since my entire college career I was never invited to anything. One of my friends that I made, Kim, offered to help me get ready and do my makeup. After my last class, we made our way to my dorm. She dressed me up and did my makeup to a T, and we were on our way. We were a little late to the party, but we got there as things were beginning to kick off. Everyone was having a good time, excited that the year was ending. I followed Kim around, mostly greeting familiar faces I had seen in certain classes. In that time, I struck up a conversation with a few of my classmates. We talked for a while when I noticed from across the room there were at least 3 guys staring at me. Their gazes were intense. It wasn't in a, I think she's really hot kind of way. They looked almost sinister. It immediately made my skin crawl. They weren't even trying to pretend that they weren't staring. I whispered to Kim, nudging in their direction. She stepped in front of me and shouted, "What the fuck are you looking at?" At that, they turned away, talking amongst themselves. And as the night continued, I was still a little uncomfortable, so I kept close to Kim. I told her I was starting to feel tired. "That's fine, I can take you back to your dorm," she said. We started making our way back to the front door. Kim was pretty social, so it took a while for us to get there because she kept stopping and talking to people. We were almost to the door when I noticed again the same group of men. They were sitting to the far left of the door, and they were giving me the same look, a pointed and eerie stare. I could feel my heart flare up into my throat again because I was hoping I wouldn't have to come across them again. As if it didn't make things worse, Lacey seemingly stepped out of nowhere, coming to a stop directly in front of them, looking directly at me with the same cold stare she would give me in class. As I watched, she sat down on one of the man's laps and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it, still giving me that cold, dead stare. I tugged at the hem of Kim's shirt. She turned around, looking at me. I couldn't get anything out, but she followed my gaze to them. "You have got to be kidding me," she said under her breath. She grabbed my hand, and we walked quickly back into the crowd. She called a couple of boys she knew in the party, all big and intimidating looking, and asked them to walk us to her car. She told them what the men and Lacey looked like, and we started off to her car again. But we went out the back door this time, one of the boys leading the way. As we hit the steps of the back porch, I got a call on my phone. I picked it up instinctively, not even looking at it, thankful for the small distraction. I could hear a bunch of noise in the background, but I could just make out a few words. "Get that bitch." I quickly realized it was Lacey's voice. I looked down at the phone and didn't recognize the number. She must have butt dialed me in the party, but the phone call was still on, and I could hear a bunch of movement. I hung up and yelled out to Kim that they were coming for me. The boys walked quickly behind us, keeping their eyes on the house as Kim and I made it to her car safely. I thanked them profusely, asking them to drive back with us, but they wanted to go back into the party and see if they were still there. Kim and I got back to the school safely, and we went directly to my teacher, who thankfully was still there. I told him everything, telling him of the suspicious men and Lacey. He said he'd handle it and told me to go to my dorm and stay there until he could get a hold of security and the dean. Kim stayed with me the entire time, comforting me. For the next 2 hours, I waited until a security guard knocked on my door with my professor. They went to the party, not finding Lacey or the men, but were keeping watch. They told me that they would keep security at my door or around me until she was found. Classes were over, so it wasn't like they'd be able to find her easy. After that night, I didn't hear from Lacey again. I graduated with no issues, passing all my classes. I didn't see her at graduation. I don't know what ever happened to her, and honestly, I don't care. I was lucky she was stupid enough to call me off her phone, and if it wasn't for her butt dialing me, I feel like it could have been worse. The moral of the story, be safe out there, please. You never know people's true intentions.